Scissors sound different when they're cutting through vintage silk. It's not a clean snip. It's a wet tearing noise, like a gasp caught in the throat. Morgan stood in the doorway, staring at the shredded remains of her $150 wedding dress pooling on the Aubusson rug. Casey stood over it, heavy gardening shears in hand, smelling faintly of Tanqueray gin and expensive mints. It had a moth hole, the older woman lied, her eyes dead and unblinking. It was 3 days before the wedding. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, settling on the butchered fabric. The dress had been, a 1930s bias-cut slip, sourced from a damp little thrift shop in Brooklyn. Morgan had spent weeks restoring it, using her skills as a textile archivist to carefully reweave the fragile seams. It smelled of dried lavender and thyme. It didn't look like money, and that was exactly why Casey Harrington despised it. Morgan didn't scream. She didn't fall to her knees in a dramatic display of heartbreak. The reaction was far less cinematic. A cold, heavy stone formed in her gut, and a metallic taste flooded her mouth. She noticed with detached clarity that Casey's knuckles were white around the handles of the shears. The older woman was breathing heavily, a slight tremor in her diamond-clad wrists. It took effort to destroy something that thoroughly. "You took shears to my dress," Morgan said. Her voice sounded thin, flat. "I did you a favor, darling," Casey replied, tossing the shears onto a velvet armchair. They landed with a heavy, disrespectful thud. "You were going to walk down the aisle of Grace Cathedral looking like a Depression-era scullery maid. The Harrington name carries weight. I simply expedited the inevitable. We have an appointment at Bergdorf's in 2 hours." Morgan looked down. The bodice was severed from the skirt. The delicate lace straps, which she had reinforced by hand late into the night, were mangled. A sudden pathetic urge to apologize washed over Morgan, a deeply ingrained working-class reflex to smooth over the anger of wealthy people. She swallowed it down, choking on the bile it brought up. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Heavy, hurried. Liam appeared behind Morgan, his face flushed. He smelled of cedarwood cologne and nervous sweat. He looked past his fiancée's shoulder, his eyes landing on the ruin on the floor, then darting up to his mother. "Mom, what is that?" Liam asked. "I handled the wardrobe issue, Liam," Casey said, walking past the destroyed dress to pour herself another drink at the crystal cart in the corner. Ice clinked against glass, a sharp, cheerful sound that made Morgan's teeth ache. Morgan turned to look at Liam. This was the moment, the pivot point. She waited for the outrage, the fury she would have felt if someone had violated something he loved. Liam dragged a hand through his hair. He didn't look at Morgan. He looked at the floor. "Jesus, Mom, you couldn't have just talked to her again? Now we have to rush." He finally met Morgan's eyes, offering a weak, placating smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's okay, Chloe. Honestly, maybe it's for the best. We'll get you something stunning, whatever you want, on my card." He reached out to touch her arm. Morgan stepped back. The fabric of his cashmere sweater brushed her bare skin, and she flinched as if burned. He didn't see the violence of what had just happened. He only saw a logistics problem. "It took me 4 months to stabilize that silk," Morgan whispered, her voice rough. "And I'll buy you a silk factory," Liam joked, a desperate attempt to lighten the suffocating air in the room. "Come on, let's just go to the city. Let her have this win, Morgan. It's easier." Morgan looked at the man she was supposed to marry. He wasn't a monster. He was just weak. A soft, insulated boy who had never had to fight for anything, who believed that a limitless credit card was a cure for cruelty. She felt a sudden, profound exhaustion. Without another word, Morgan turned and walked down the long, echoing corridor. Behind her, she heard Casey's sharp voice murmuring something about working-class theatrics, and Liam's muffled, exhausted sigh. The guest suite felt like a mausoleum. Dark mahogany furniture, heavy brocade curtains that smelled faintly of old dust, and a suffocating silence. Morgan locked the door. She didn't cry. Crying felt like a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Instead, she walked into the ensuite bathroom, stripped off her clothes, and sat on the cold marble floor of the shower. The physical shock was wearing off, leaving behind a raw, pulsing ache. It wasn't just about the dress. It was the realization of what her life would be. 1,000 little cuts, 1,000 moments where Casey would overstep, destroy, and dictate, while Liam handed Morgan a shiny new toy to dry her tears. She pressed her forehead against the cool tile. Her stomach cramped violently, and she leaned over, dry heaving over the drain. The acrid taste of stomach acid grounded her. It stripped away the fairy tale illusion that had clouded her judgment for the past 2 years. She got up, rinsed her mouth, and walked back into the bedroom. She pulled her battered canvas duffel bag from the closet. It looked absurd sitting on the Egyptian cotton duvet. She started throwing her things into it: t-shirts, jeans, her laptop. She didn't pack the jewelry Liam had given her. She left the diamond tennis bracelet on the nightstand, beside a crystal lamp. Her phone buzzed on the bed, a jarring synthetic vibration against the mattress. She ignored it, continuing to fold her worn sweaters. It buzzed again, and again. Annoyed, she picked it up. It was an international number. France. Morgan frowned. She wiped a stray smudge of mascara from under her eye and hit accept. Hello. Morgan. It is Henri. The voice was crisp, heavily accented, and carried an undercurrent of sharp authority. Henri Laurent. The head conservator and chief archivist for the House of Valois, one of the oldest and most discreet royal design houses in Europe. 3 years ago, before she met Liam, Morgan had spent 8 months locked in a temperature-controlled vault in Paris, helping Henri restore a 16th-century coronation mantle that the house's previous staff had nearly ruined. Henri, Morgan said, her voice cracking slightly. She cleared her throat. Hi, it's been a while. I am calling because your grandmother's dress, Henri said, ignoring pleasantries. The 1930s bias cut. You sent me photos of the silk degradation last month to ask about the enzyme wash. Yeah, Morgan said, closing her eyes. The memory felt like it belonged to a different person. I fixed it. Is it finished? You're marrying the American boy this weekend, yes? Morgan looked at the half-packed duffel bag. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. No, I mean, yes, the wedding is supposed to be Saturday, but the dress is gone. A pause on the line. Gone? A fire? A mother-in-law, Morgan said flatly. The absurdity of saying it out loud made her chest tighten. She took garden shears to it an hour ago, sliced it in half. The silence from Paris was absolute. In the high-stakes world of textile preservation, destroying historical garments was akin to murder. When Henri finally spoke, his voice had dropped an octave. It was no longer the voice of a friendly colleague. It was the voice of a man who commanded empires of silk and thread. She used shears on the bias. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of horror. Yeah. And the boy? The fiancé? Told me he'd buy me a Vera Wang and to let her have the win. Henri scoffed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed through the phone. New money. They think history can be bought off a rack. Morgan, listen to me very carefully. Where are you? At their estate in Connecticut. I'm packing my bags, Henri. I'm leaving. You will not leave, Henri commanded softly. Not yet. You will not let this woman with her cheap shears think she has routed you out the back door like a servant. Henri, I don't care about beating her. I just want to go home. You care, he countered. I hear it in your breath. You're angry. Good. Anger is a much better corset than grief. You stay. You smile at dinner. Tomorrow morning you will receive a delivery. Do not buy a dress from the department store. Henri, what are you talking about? You're in Paris. The House of Valois has a private atelier in New York for our sovereign clients, Henri said, his tone turning dangerously smug. We have something in the vault, a prototype. It was commissioned by the Crown Princess of Denmark, but she became pregnant, and the silhouette no longer accommodated her. It has been waiting for someone who understands its architecture. I can't afford a Valois prototype, Henri. I can barely afford the train ticket back to Brooklyn. Did I ask you for a credit card, Morgan? Henry snapped gently. You saved the coronation mantle. You saved my legacy when the board wanted me retired. You are family to the house. Let the American woman see what real power looks like. Then, if you wish to leave the boy, leave him in it. The line went dead. Morgan stood in the center of the dark room, the phone pressed to her ear, listening to the dial tone. Her heart was beating a strange, erratic rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at her canvas bag, then at the heavy mahogany door. Slowly she began to unpack. The next morning, the air in the Harrington estate was thick with artificial normalcy. Casey acted as though the butchering of the dress had been a collective fever dream. At breakfast, she sat at the head of the long dining table, buttering an artisanal crumpet, discussing floral arrangements. Liam looked relieved. He shot Morgan grateful, pathetic little smiles over his coffee cup, mistaking her silence for submission. Morgan ate her eggs methodically. The metallic taste from yesterday was gone, replaced by a cold, frightening clarity. She felt detached, hovering above the room, watching these people play house. I've had the Bentley brought around, Casey announced, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. We have a 10 o'clock at the bridal boutique. I called ahead. They've pulled several tasteful options. A-lines. Something with structure to give you some shape, dear. Morgan took a slow sip of her orange juice. Cancel it. The clinking of silverware stopped. Liam froze, his coffee cup midway to his mouth. Casey lowered her napkin, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. Excuse me? Casey said. Cancel the appointment, Morgan repeated, her voice perfectly level. My dress is being delivered here this morning. Casey let out a sharp, derisive laugh. Delivered? From where? Did you order something off the internet, Morgan? Need I remind you there will be a senator at this wedding? It's being handled, Morgan said. Morgan, come on, Liam whispered, leaning in. Don't do this. Mom's trying to help. Before Morgan could answer, the deep, resonant chime of the estate's front gate echoed through the dining room intercom. Casey frowned, pressing the button on the wall panel. Yes? Mrs. Harrington, the security guard's voice crackled. There is a convoy here. A convoy? Casey stood up, tightening the belt of her silk robe. Morgan didn't move. She just turned her head toward the massive bay windows that overlooked the circular driveway. 3 sleek, matte black Mercedes Sprinter vans pulled through the wrought iron gates, moving with slow, synchronized precision. They didn't look like delivery vehicles. They looked like a tactical detail. They parked in perfect alignment in front of the sweeping marble steps. Casey marched out of the dining room and into the grand foyer, Liam and Morgan trailing behind. As Casey threw open the heavy oak double doors, the side doors of the van slid open simultaneously. 6 men and women stepped out. They were dressed immaculately in tailored charcoal suits, wearing pristine white cotton gloves. They moved in total silence. 2 of them unrolled a heavy canvas runner over the driveway gravel to prevent dust from kicking up. From the center van stepped a tall, striking woman with severe silver hair pulled into a tight chignon. She wore a black cape coat and carried a brushed steel briefcase. She walked up the marble steps, her sharp heels clicking like a metronome. Can I help you? Casey demanded, crossing her arms. She stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance, trying to assert her territory. If you're the caterers, the service entrance is around back. The silver-haired woman stopped 1 step below Casey. She didn't look at the older woman's face. She looked briefly at Casey's robe, a microscopic twitch of disdain playing on her lips. I am Madame Vane, director of the New York Atelier for the House of Valois, she said, her voice carrying a clipped, aristocratic British accent. She bypassed Casey completely, her eyes scanning the foyer until they locked onto Morgan. Madame Vane's severe expression melted into a look of deep reverence. She stepped past Casey, who sputtered in indignation, and approached Morgan. To Casey and Liam's absolute shock, the director bowed her head slightly. Mademoiselle Morgan, Vane said softly, Monsieur Laurent sends his deepest affections, and his apologies that you are enduring such uncultured circumstances. She threw a glacial side-eye toward the ruined silk still sitting in the wastebasket by the hall console. Valois? Casey interrupted, her voice shrill. Her carefully constructed mask was slipping. The House of Valois didn't sell to the public. They didn't have storefronts. You couldn't buy your way in. You had to be invited by bloodline or extraordinary merit. There must be a mistake. We didn't commission anything from Valois. You did not, madame, Vane said without looking at her. We do not dress new money. We are here for the archivist. Vane snapped her fingers. The team of handlers moved into the foyer. 4 of them carried a massive, temperature-controlled archival trunk forged of black carbon fiber. They set it down gently in the center of the marble floor. The air in the room shifted. It smelled of ozone, cedar, and the crisp, intimidating scent of pristine tissue paper. Vane input a code into the briefcase, extracting a small silver key. She unlocked the trunk. The hiss of depressurized air echoed in the silent foyer. Morgan stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat. As the handlers lifted the garment out, the morning light pouring through the transom windows caught it, casting fractured rainbows across the walls. It wasn't a puffy, gaudy princess dress. It was a masterpiece of textile engineering. The gown was woven from threads of spun platinum and raw, unbleached silk. The bodice featured historical Alençon lace, intricately embroidered with thousands of microscopic seed pearls that cascaded down the skirt like freezing rain. It possessed a weight, a gravity, that made every other object in the room look cheap. It didn't shout wealth. It whispered history, power, and untouchable artistry. Valued at over $5 million, it was a museum piece meant for a queen, brought to a Connecticut suburb out of pure, unadulterated spite and respect. My God, Liam breathed, stepping forward, his eyes wide with avarice and awe. He reached a hand out to touch the lace. Before his fingers could graze the fabric, one of the handlers, a man built like a linebacker, stepped smoothly in front of Liam, physically blocking him. Gloves only, sir, the handler said, his voice hard. Casey was hyperventilating, her eyes darting from the gown to Morgan. How did you fix old books? You're a seamstress. Morgan finally looked at Casey. The older woman looked small. The arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only the panicked confusion of a bully who realizes they've picked a fight with a giant. Morgan didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She reached out, her bare, calloused fingers that had earned the right to touch such garments, brushing against the spun platinum. The texture was rough and cold, grounding her. I preserve history, Casey, Morgan said, her voice dropping into the quiet, resonant space the gown had created. You destroy things because you don't understand their value, but you're going to understand this. Revenge rarely comes wrapped in tulle, but when it does, it leaves a mark. If you felt the chill of that vintage silk tearing or the fierce satisfaction of a $5 million mic drop, hit that like button. We all know a Casey, but not all of us get the royal treatment to shut her down. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that true value isn't dictated by snobs. Subscribe to the channel for more raw, unfiltered drama. What would you have done? Let me know in the comments below. The bedroom door clicked shut, severing the chaotic, vibrating energy of the hallway. Inside the guest suite, the air had fundamentally changed. It no longer smelled of old dust and Casey's oppressive floral arrangements. It smelled of ozone, crisp tissue paper, and the metallic tang of heavy spun platinum. The makeshift atelier was silent save for the synchronized, rustling movements of the Valois handlers. Madame Vane directed the process with surgical precision. They erected a freestanding 3-way mirror in the center of the Persian rug and unfurled a white velvet dropcloth beneath it. Morgan stood in the middle of the room, stripped down to her plain cotton underwear, shivering slightly. The contrast was absurd. She was a girl who bought her groceries on discount, standing amidst carbon fiber trunks, holding a garment worth more than the entire estate she was standing in. "Arms up, mademoiselle," Vane murmured. Her voice lacked the sharp edge it had possessed downstairs. Here, in the presence of the dress, it was a hushed, reverent whisper. Morgan raised her arms. The handlers lifted the gown. It didn't float. It descended. When the fabric settled against her skin, Morgan gasped. It was shockingly heavy. The raw, unbleached silk and the thousands of microscopic seed pearls carried a dense gravitational pull. It felt less like clothing and more like a suit of armor forged for a very specific, beautiful war. The handlers moved around her, their white-gloved hands fastening a labyrinth of hidden hooks and silk-covered buttons. Every click and snap felt like a lock turning on a vault. "The architecture is flawless," Vane noted, her sharp eyes scanning the seams. She knelt, the joints of her knees popping quietly in the still room, to adjust the hem. Henri was correct. The crown princess lacked the shoulders to carry the bodice. You, however, you hold tension in your collarbones. It gives the lace something to grip. Morgan stared at herself in the three-way mirror. The reflection didn't feel like her. The girl in the mirror was terrifying. The spun platinum threads caught the morning light, radiating a cold lunar glow. The dress didn't make her look like a bride. It made her look like a monarch who had just ordered an execution. A sharp, frantic knock rattled the mahogany door. "Morgan? Chloe, it's me! Open the door!" Liam's voice was muffled through the heavy wood. He sounded breathless, desperate. Vane didn't even look up from the hem. She merely flicked 2 fingers at the handler built like a linebacker. The man stepped to the door, unlocked it, and opened it exactly 3 inches. "No entry during a fitting," the handler rumbled. "I'm the groom," Liam protested, his face appearing in the narrow crack. His eyes immediately bypassed the handler, frantically searching the room until they landed on Morgan in the mirror. He stopped pushing against the door. His mouth opened slightly. Morgan watched his reflection. She saw the avarice return to his eyes, brighter and sharper than before. He wasn't looking at the woman he loved. He was looking at an asset. "Morgan," Liam breathed, his voice cracking. "My God, you look... I mean, the press is going to lose their minds. A Valois prototype? Do you know what this does for us? The senator's wife wears off-the-rack Oscar de la Renta. This puts us in a completely different stratosphere." A cold nausea bloomed in the pit of Morgan's stomach. It tasted like old pennies. The dress, for all its beauty, suddenly felt like a cage tightening around her ribs. "Is that what this is to you, Liam?" Morgan asked, her voice barely carrying over the rustle of the handler's movements. She didn't turn to face him. She kept her eyes locked on his reflection in the glass. "Stratospheres? Press?" Liam blinked, genuinely confused by her tone. "What?" "No, Chloe, come on. I'm just saying this changes things. Mom is downstairs making calls right now. She's telling everyone she pulled a massive favor with a European contact to secure it for you. It's a great narrative." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Madame Vane paused, her needle hovering a millimeter above the platinum thread. Morgan closed her eyes. The image of her $150 thrifted dress, shredded on the floor, flashed behind her eyelids. Casey had killed the thing Morgan loved, and now, presented with something she couldn't destroy, Casey was simply claiming ownership of it. And Liam, sweet, cowardly Liam, was perfectly fine with the theft, so long as it made his family look good. "Close the door," Morgan whispered. "Wait, Morgan." "Close the door!" she barked, a sudden, unfamiliar ferocity tearing through her throat. The handler slammed the door shut, cutting off Liam's voice with a definitive thud. The lock engaged with a sharp click. Morgan stood rigid, her breathing shallow and ragged against the unyielding structure of the historical bodice. A single hot tear escaped her eye, tracking down her cheek and dropping onto the Alençon lace. She expected it to leave a stain. But the spun platinum simply repelled the moisture, letting the tear roll off and vanish into the rug. "Do not weep onto the archives, mademoiselle. Vane said softly, rising to her feet. The older woman reached out with a gloved thumb and gently wiped the dampness from Morgan's cheek line. It wasn't a motherly gesture. It was the clinical care of a curator protecting an exhibit. Tears are for things that are lost. You are not losing. You are simply waking up. Morgan looked at her hands. Her knuckles were white. She took a slow, deep breath, feeling the silk press back against her expanding lungs. It was restrictive, yes, but it was also impenetrable. "You're right," Morgan said, her voice dropping into a hollow, deadpan register. "Let's finish the fitting. I have a rehearsal dinner to attend." The Oakwood Country Club smelled of floor wax, roasted shallots, and generations of casual, unchallenged entitlement. The dining room was a cavernous space draped in heavy velvet, illuminated by massive crystal chandeliers that clinked softly whenever the air conditioning kicked on. Morgan sat at the long table, the acoustic chaos of 40 wealthy guests washing over her. The clatter of silver against fine porcelain sounded like tiny, aggressive swords. She was wearing a simple, dark navy slip dress she had packed in her duffel. It was remarkably unremarkable, a stark contrast to the Valois secret locked in her room. To her right sat Liam, radiating a nervous, manic energy. He was drinking his scotch too fast, the ice cracking violently against the heavy glass tumbler. To her left sat Arthur Harrington, Liam's father, a man who smelled perpetually of damp wool and defeat, having surrendered his spine to Casey 3 decades prior. And at the head of the table sat Casey. She was holding court, a glass of vintage champagne balanced delicately between 2 fingers. She wore a forced, glittering smile that didn't reach the icy blue of her eyes. Her voice carried over the din, pitched at the exact frequency required to ensure the entire table heard her. "Oh, it was nothing, really," Casey was saying to a woman named Clara, whose face was pulled tight by recent, expensive surgery. "I simply made a few calls. You know how these European houses are. They love an American pedigree. When I told them about Liam and our family's connections in Washington, they practically begged to send over the Valois piece." Morgan took a slow sip of her water. It tasted metallic, though whether from the plumbing or the phantom blood in her mouth, she couldn't tell. "Valois?" Clara gasped, leaning forward so quickly her heavy pearl necklace swung and struck her soup spoon. "Casey, you're joking. They don't do bridal. They don't do anything commercial." "Well, exceptions are made for the right people, Clara," Casey purred smoothly, taking a tiny, satisfied sip of her champagne. She shot a quick, poisonous glance down the table toward Morgan. "I simply couldn't let our dear Morgan walk down the aisle in that rag she brought with her. A mother has to step in when a girl lacks direction." Liam flinched next to Morgan. He reached out under the heavy linen tablecloth and placed his sweaty palm over her knee. "Just ignore her," he hissed in a panicked whisper. "Let her have her story. It makes everything easier." Morgan looked down at his hand. His fingers were trembling slightly. She felt nothing. No anger, no betrayal, no heartbreak. The emotional center of her brain had neatly severed itself from the nervous system, leaving behind a sterile, hyper-vigilant calm. She reached under the table, gripped Liam's wrist, and physically removed his hand from her leg. She dropped his arm back onto his lap as if it were a dead fish. Liam swallowed hard, turning back to his scotch. "Morgan, darling," Casey called out, her voice cutting through the overlapping conversations. The table gradually quieted down, sensing the shift in the air. Predatory eyes turned toward her. "Clara was just asking about the dress. I was telling her how grateful you were that I intervened to save the aesthetic of the wedding." Morgan slowly placed her water glass on the table. The condensation left a dark ring on the white linen. She looked down the length of the table, past the orchids and the sterling silver butter dishes, meeting Casey's gaze directly. "Grateful," Morgan repeated. The word sounded foreign on her tongue. "Yes, darling," Casey prompted, her smile turning brittle at the edges. A silent warning flashed in her eyes. "Play along. Know your place." Morgan leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. The posture was informal, a calculated breach of a country club etiquette. It's fascinating, Casey, Morgan said, her voice conversational, yet pitched to carry exactly to the edges of the room. The way you construct reality. The silence in the room thickened. Someone in the back dropped a fork, the clatter echoing like a gunshot. Morgan, Arthur Harrington mumbled into his napkin, a weak attempt at mediation. No, Arthur, it's fine, Casey snapped, her neck flushing red under her diamond collar. She turned her venomous smile back to Morgan. I'm sure Morgan is just overwhelmed. It's a lot for someone from her background to process. My background, Morgan mused, trailing a fingernail along the rim of her water glass. A high, singing note filled the tense air. My background is in textile conservation, which is why Henri Laurent, the director of Valois, called me on my personal cell phone. He called me because I spent 8 months restoring a coronation mantle for his house. Casey's smile finally cracked. The muscles around her mouth spasmed. Morgan, stop! He sent the dress, Casey, Morgan continued, her voice devoid of any theatrical emotion. It was simply a factual report, which made it all the more devastating. He sent a $5 million archival prototype, flanked by armed security, not because you made a phone call, not because of the Harrington pedigree. He sent it as an apology. Clara gasped loudly, a vulgar sound of pure, unadulterated gossip. An apology for what? Clara asked, unable to help herself. Morgan, I am warning you, Casey hissed, abandoning all pretense of volume control. Her hands were gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles mirrored the white linen. An apology, Morgan said, turning her gaze to Clara. Because yesterday afternoon, Casey took heavy gardening shears and hacked my original wedding dress to pieces on the floor of the guest suite. The collective inhalation of breath around the table sucked the oxygen from the room. It was one thing to be manipulative, it was another to be physically destructive. In their sanitized world of passive aggression, taking shears to a garment was an act of shocking, uncivilized violence. Casey stood up, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. You lying little gold digger! Liam, controller! Everyone looked at Liam, the golden boy, the heir. Liam looked at his scotch. He looked at his mother's furious face, contorted with rage. He looked at the 40 wealthy, influential guests staring at him, waiting for him to manage the scandal. He opened his mouth, closed it. He wiped a bead of sweat from his temple. Mom, maybe we should just calm down, Liam stammered weakly, shrinking back into his chair. Let's not do this here. Morgan watched him fold. It was the final confirmation she needed. The last stubborn thread of her illusion snapped, severing cleanly without a sound. She didn't scream. She didn't throw her drink in his face. She simply picked up her small, battered leather clutch from the floor. She stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate, drawing every eye in the room. You don't need to control me, Liam, Morgan said softly. She looked down at him. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Because I'm not playing this game anymore. She turned to Casey, who was still standing, her chest heaving, the picture of aristocratic ruin. You wanted me out of the picture, Casey. You cut up my dress to humiliate me, Morgan said, the sensory memories rushing back, the smell of gin, the heavy thud of the shears. But you underestimated what happens when you destroy things people love. Henri didn't send the gown for me to marry your son in. He sent it so I could walk out the door looking like a queen. Morgan pushed her chair in. The sound was horribly loud in the dead silent room. I'll have my things out of the guest room by midnight, Morgan said. She turned and walked away from the table, her sensible heels clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The smell of roasted shallots and expensive panic faded behind her, replaced by the cool, clean draft of the exit doors. The night air hit her face, sharp and bracing. She walked down the country club steps, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the massive, terrifying rush of adrenaline that came with burning a bridge while standing entirely alone on the other side. Gravel crunched under the tires of the rideshare sedan as it pulled through the wrought iron gates of the Harrington estate. The sprawling brick manor loomed in the dark, windows glowing with automated security lights. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress holding its breath. Morgan thanked the driver, stepped out into the humid Connecticut night, and walked up the sweeping marble steps. Her sensible heels, which had sounded so decisive on the country club floor, now felt like lead weights. Inside, the foyer was eerily quiet. The scent of Casey's signature Casablanca lilies was overpowering, thick and cloying, masking the faint smell of floor wax. Morgan bypassed the grand staircase and walked straight toward the guest suite. Her chest felt hollowed out, scraped clean of the anxiety that had paralyzed her for months. The adrenaline was receding, leaving behind a profound aching exhaustion in her joints. She opened the heavy mahogany door. The room was not empty. Madame Vane stood by the bay window, a silver flask in her gloved hand. The carbon fiber trunk sat in the center of the Persian rug, open, its interior glowing with soft LED lights. The handlers were methodically dismantling the freestanding three-way mirror, their movements silent and practiced. The Valois gown still hung on its velvet form, casting that same cold, lunar glow across the dark wood paneling. "You are back early, mademoiselle," Vane said, turning from the window. She did not sound surprised. She capped the flask with a quiet metallic click and slid it into the pocket of her black cape coat. "I assume the rehearsal dinner lacked culinary merit." "I burned it down," Morgan said. Her voice cracked, betraying the stoicism she was desperately trying to maintain. She walked over to the bed and dragged her battered canvas duffel bag from the closet. "I burned the whole thing down." Vane watched her with analytical eyes. "A controlled burn is necessary for healthy soil. It clears out the rot." The older woman gestured to the linebacker-sized handler. "Prepare the garment for transit." Morgan stopped unzipping her bag. She looked at the dress. The spun platinum threads shimmered, catching the ambient light. It was breathtaking. It was a $5 million suit of armor, and it was going back into a box. "You're taking it back to Paris," Morgan said, the reality of it settling over her. "We are taking it to the vault in New York," Vane corrected gently. She walked over to the dress, brushing a stray piece of lint off the velvet form. "Monsieur Laurent sent this to remind you of your worth, Morgan. He did not send it so you could marry a coward in it. When I received word from my security team that you had left the country club alone, I knew the fitting was permanently concluded." Morgan resumed packing. T-shirts, jeans, her worn leather toiletry bag. The zipper sounded harsh and abrasive in the quiet room. She walked into the ensuite bathroom to grab her toothbrush. The cold marble floor beneath her feet grounded her. Beside the trash can, wrapped in a plastic liner, were the shredded remains of her thrifted silk slip. She stared at the butchered fabric. A few hours ago, the sight of it had made her dry heave. Now it just looked like old laundry. The sentimental attachment had been violently severed. Casey hadn't just destroyed a dress. She had destroyed the illusion of the family Morgan thought she was joining. "Leave it." Vane's voice drifted from the doorway. The director stood leaning against the doorframe, watching Morgan stare at the trash. "Do not take the ruin with you. Let the woman clean up her own vandalism." Morgan nodded slowly. She tossed her toothbrush into her canvas bag and zipped it shut. The bag was embarrassingly small, sitting next to the massive high-tech Valois trunk. The handlers were now carefully lowering the spun platinum gown into the protective casing. The hiss of depressurized air filled the room as they sealed the lid, locking away the masterpiece. It was over. The fairy tale, the nightmare, all of it packed into two drastically different containers. "My car is waiting outside," Morgan said, slinging the heavy duffel strap over her shoulder. The canvas dug into her collarbone. It hurt, but it was a real tangible pain. "I'm going to wait on the porch. I don't want to be in here when they get back." "You will not wait on the porch like a dismissed servant," Vane commanded. Her aristocratic British accent clipped the ends of her words sharply. "You will leave this estate in the center van. My team will drop you at your apartment in Brooklyn." Morgan blinked, taken aback. "Madame Vane, I can't ask you to do that. You're hauling a $5 million archive piece. And I am hauling the woman who saved the coronation mantle, Vane countered, her severe face softening by a fraction of a millimeter. Do not argue with me, child. I have been dealing with entitled aristocrats all day. Do not make me deal with an entitled martyr. A weak, genuine laugh escaped Morgan's lips. It felt good. It felt like breathing after being underwater for too long. Before they could move toward the door, the heavy crunch of tires echoing on the driveway gravel signaled a chaotic arrival. Headlights swept across the bay windows, casting long, distorted shadows against the bedroom walls. Car doors slammed, plural, heavy, angry slams that vibrated through the floorboards. They were back. Footsteps pounded down the hallway, lacking any of the refined grace the Harrington estate usually demanded. The mahogany door burst open. Liam stood in the frame, his face flushed, his tie yanked loose. He smelled of stale scotch, nervous sweat, and utter panic. Behind him, hovering like a storm cloud, was Casey. Her forced smile was entirely gone, replaced by a tight, rigid mask of fury. Liam's eyes darted frantically around the room. He saw the sealed carbon fiber trunk, the handlers standing in silent formation, and finally, Morgan, with her canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Chloe, Liam gasped, bracing his hands against the door frame as if he needed it to stay upright. Chloe, please, you don't have to do this. We can fix it. Morgan didn't move. She felt the heavy strap of her bag cutting into her shoulder. She let the silence stretch, forcing him to sit in the uncomfortable reality of what he was asking. Fix what, Liam? Morgan asked. Her voice was calm. It wasn't the hysterical shouting he was clearly braced for. It was a quiet, clinical question. This! Liam gestured wildly around the room. Walking out of the rehearsal dinner, embarrassing my mother in front of the entire club. We have a senator coming tomorrow, Morgan. You can't just throw a tantrum and blow up a 2-year relationship because you're mad. A tantrum, Morgan repeated, testing the word on her tongue. She looked at Casey, who was standing stiffly behind her son, her diamond-clad fingers curled into tight fists. Your mother took shears to my property, and you told me to let her have the win. There is no tantrum, Liam. There is only a boundary. And you are on the wrong side of it. I'll buy you another dress, Liam pleaded, taking a step into the room. One of the Valois handlers subtly shifted his weight, blocking Liam's path to the carbon fiber trunk. I told you, whatever you want. You want the Valois? We'll pay them for it. We'll write a check right now. Madame Vane let out a sharp, aristocratic scoff that sounded like breaking glass. You do not have enough zeros in your checking account to purchase Valois history, little boy, and even if you did, we do not accept currency from cowards. Liam whipped his head toward Vane, his face contorting with arrogant rage. Excuse me? Who the hell do you think you are talking to in my house? Liam, stop, Casey hissed, finally stepping past her son. She glared at Vane, then turned her cold, dead eyes to Morgan. You have made your point, Morgan. You humiliated us. You extracted your little pound of flesh. Now put the bag down. We will release a statement to the guests tomorrow saying you had a mild panic attack due to wedding stress. We will proceed with the ceremony. Morgan stared at the older woman. The absolute refusal to accept defeat was staggering. Casey Harrington would rather marry her son off to a woman who despised them both than admit a public failure. It was pathetic. There is no ceremony, Casey, Morgan said, adjusting her grip on the duffel bag. I'm leaving. If you walk out that door, Casey warned, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper, you will never step foot in this circle again. You will go back to your damp little Brooklyn apartment, and you will be nothing. You are throwing away a life most girls would kill for. I'd rather be nothing than be you, Morgan said. It wasn't a rehearsed line. It was a simple, absolute truth that fell from her lips like gravity. Casey's face hardened. She took a step forward, raising a hand as if to snatch the canvas bag from Morgan's shoulder. Before she could close the distance, the linebacker-sized handler stepped smoothly between them. He didn't say a word. He didn't raise his hands. He simply existed in the space between the Harrington matriarch and the archivist, an immovable wall of tailored charcoal wool. Casey froze, her eyes snapping up to the handler's impassive face. She let her hand drop. "We are departing," Vane announced, clapping her gloved hands together once. The sound was sharp, like a starting pistol. "Load the trunk." The handlers moved flawlessly. 4 of them hoisted the carbon fiber vault, maneuvering it easily past Liam, who had to press his back against the hallway wall to avoid being crushed. Vane walked out next, her sharp heels clicking rhythmically, completely ignoring the Harringtons. Morgan was the last to leave the room. She paused in the doorway. Liam was staring at her, his eyes wet, his lower lip trembling. He looked like a child who had just dropped his ice cream cone. He didn't look like a husband. "Goodbye, Liam," Morgan said softly. She didn't feel angry at him anymore. She just felt sorry for him. He was trapped in this house, with this mother, forever. And he didn't even know it. She turned and walked down the long, echoing corridor for the last time. The air in the foyer still smelled of Casablanca lilies, but as she stepped out through the heavy oak double doors, the night air hit her. It smelled of damp earth, distant rain, and asphalt. It smelled like freedom. The 3 matte black Mercedes Sprinter vans were idling in the circular driveway, their engines humming with quiet, suppressed power. The side door of the center van was open. Vane was already inside, sitting opposite the carbon fiber trunk, reading a file. Morgan walked down the marble steps. She didn't look back at the grand brick manor. She didn't look back at the life she had narrowly escaped. She climbed into the back of the van, throwing her worn canvas duffel bag onto the floorboard next to the $5 million vault. The handler slid the heavy door shut. The lock engaged with a loud, definitive thud. The sound was entirely different from the tearing of vintage silk. It was the sound of a door closing, clean, solid, absolute. As the van pulled away, the tires crunching over the gravel, Morgan leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. The tension in her jaw finally released. She was alone, driving into the dark, wearing thrifted clothes, leaving behind a fortune. And for the first time in 2 years, she felt perfectly, undeniably rich. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Henri. Did the armor fit? Morgan pulled the phone out, the harsh blue light illuminating her face in the dark cabin. She typed back with her thumb, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across her face. It fit perfectly, but I left it in the vault. Good, Henri replied instantly. A queen does not wear her armor to a peasant's parade. Get some rest. We have a 17th century tapestry arriving on Tuesday. You're needed. Morgan locked her screen and dropped the phone into her lap. She listened to the hum of the tires against the highway. Tuesday. She had work on Tuesday. The world was still spinning. The fabric of her life hadn't unraveled. It had simply been cut clean, ready to be stitched into something new. She watched the streetlights flicker past the tinted windows, painting amber streaks across the dark interior. The city skyline began to rise in the distance, a jagged horizon of concrete and glass that looked infinitely more beautiful than the manicured lawns of Connecticut. She pulled a worn gray cardigan from her bag, wrapping it tightly around her shoulders against the air conditioning. It smelled faintly of coffee and subway exhaust, the scent of her real life. Beside her, Madame Vane turned a page in her file, the crisp rustle of paper sounding like an old, familiar song. No more pretending. No more biting her tongue while wealthy people treated her history like a disposable napkin. She was an archivist. She preserved things that mattered. And starting tonight, the first thing she was going to preserve was her own dignity. The van merged onto the interstate, the engine settling into a steady, comforting rhythm, carrying her away from the ruins and straight toward home. Brooklyn smelled like wet concrete, roasting coffee beans, and the faint, acrid bite of exhaust fumes when Morgan finally unlocked the deadbolt to her apartment. Her key stuck in the cylinder, requiring a harsh, aggressive jiggle to turn, a familiar friction she hadn't realized she missed. Pushing the heavy, paint-chipped door open, she stepped into the narrow hallway. It was 3 a.m. The air inside was stale, trapped for days, holding the scent of old paper from her bookshelves and the ghost of burnt toast from last week. She dropped the canvas duffel bag. It hit the scuffed hardwood floor with a dull, unceremonious thud. No marble echoes, no handlers. Just her, the hum of the ancient refrigerator in the kitchenette, and the sudden deafening quiet. She didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, she walked to the window and stared down at the street lamp, casting long, yellow shadows over a row of battered trash cans. The adrenaline that had propelled her out of the country club, through the heavy oak doors, and into the Valois van was entirely gone. In its place, a crushing leaden exhaustion seeped into her bones. Her knees physically ached. Her scalp felt tight, a dull throb pulsing behind her eyes. This was the crash. The physiological toll of tearing your own life apart with your bare hands. Moving to the bathroom, she turned on the faucet. The pipe shuddered, spitting out a burst of rusty water before running clear. She cupped her hands, bringing the freezing water to her face. It shocked her system, leaving her skin raw and tight. Looking in the smudged mirror above the sink, she didn't see a triumphant hero. She saw a girl with smeared mascara, a pale complexion, and dark, bruised-looking circles under her eyes. She looked wrecked. Her left hand rested on the edge of the porcelain sink. The diamond ring caught the harsh, fluorescent glow of the bathroom bulb. 3 carats. Emerald cut. Platinum band. Liam had proposed at a curated, aggressively photographed dinner in Nantucket, but the ring had never truly felt like his choice. It had Casey's fingerprints all over it. Ostentatious, heavy, designed to be catalogued by onlookers rather than cherished by the wearer. It was a beautiful, cold shackle. Morgan grabbed the metal band. It was tight over her knuckle, swollen from the humidity and the stress of the day. She twisted it, the hard edges scraping painfully against her skin, until it popped free. The sudden absence of weight on her finger was jarring. A pale, indented ring of skin remained, a physical scar of the last 2 years. She set the diamond on the edge of the sink. It looked ridiculous sitting next to her cracked plastic soap dispenser and a tube of generic toothpaste. It was just a rock. Stripped of the Harrington name, stripped of the country club lighting, it held absolutely no power here. Sleep did not come easily. She lay on her slightly lumpy mattress, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. Her phone, plugged into the wall across the room, vibrated continuously for the first hour. A relentless, buzzing insect demanding attention. Liam. Casey. Probably Clara, hungry for more details. She didn't get up to look. She let them scream into the void. Eventually, the buzzing stopped. The silence that followed was heavier, filled only with the rhythmic clatter of the N train rumbling over the tracks 3 blocks away. She pulled the thin cotton quilt up to her chin, breathing in the scent of her own cheap laundry detergent. It wasn't cashmere. It wasn't spun platinum. But it was hers. And for the first time in months, she fell asleep without clenching her jaw. Morning arrived with the harsh, unforgiving glare of the sun cutting through the gap in her blinds. Her mouth tasted like old copper. She dragged herself out of bed, her body stiff, moving with the sluggishness of someone recovering from a severe flu. The kitchen floor was cold against her bare feet. She scooped cheap, pre-ground coffee into a stained filter, the familiar, slightly burnt smell bringing a small measure of comfort. While the machine gurgled and sputtered, she walked over to the bathroom and picked up the ring. She didn't orchestrate a grand ritual. There was no dramatic toss off the Brooklyn Bridge. She found a padded manila envelope in her junk drawer, wrapped the ring in a single sheet of paper towel, and shoved it inside. She wrote Liam's address in sharp block letters using a dying ballpoint pen. The tape dispenser let out a harsh, abrasive screech as she tore off a piece to seal the flap. It was an administrative task, a final mundane chore to process a closed account. She dropped the envelope by the door. She spent the weekend existing in a state of suspended animation. She ate a greasy egg and cheese sandwich from the corner bodega, sitting on her fire escape, watching a stray cat stalk a pigeon. She cried once, a sudden ugly sob that hit her while she was washing her coffee mug. It wasn't for Liam, it was for the thrifted silk slip, the hundreds of hours she had poured into fixing something she loved, only to watch it get butchered. She let herself cry, feeling the hot tears track down her neck, soaking into the collar of her t-shirt. She didn't wipe them away. She let the grief run its course, a necessary, messy purge of the toxicity she had allowed into her life. By Monday evening, the hollow feeling in her chest had begun to solidify into something hard and resilient. Tuesday morning brought rain, a relentless, driving downpour that turned the New York streets into slick, gray mirrors. Morgan wore her heavy combat boots, the thick rubber soles slapping rhythmically against the wet pavement as she walked from the subway to the Valois Atelier in Tribeca. The building was aggressively nondescript, a towering structure of weathered red brick and black iron fire escapes, devoid of any signage. You either knew it was there or you walked right past it. She punched the security code into the rusted keypad by the service door. The heavy metal lock disengaged with a solid, satisfying clank. Stepping inside, the sensory shift was immediate. The chaotic noise of the city vanished, replaced by the sterile, temperature-controlled hum of the climate systems. The air smelled of distilled water, ammonia, and the distinct dusty odor of ancient decaying wool. It was the scent of history holding its breath. Morgan shook the rain from her umbrella and walked through the security vestibule into the main restoration floor. It was a massive, open-plan space, illuminated by banks of color-corrective LED lights. Stainless steel tables spanned the length of the room, scattered with magnifying loops, delicate tweezers, and spools of thread so fine they looked like spider silk. Madame Vane was already there. She stood at the far end of the room, her silver hair pulled back into its usual severe chignon, wearing a crisp white lab coat over her black turtleneck. She was leaning over a massive, slanted wooden frame, examining something through a jeweler's loupe. "You are 5 minutes late, mademoiselle," Vane said, not looking up from her work. Her clipped, aristocratic accent cut clearly through the quiet room. "The N train flooded," Morgan replied, her voice steady. She took off her damp coat and hung it on a rack near the door. "Good morning to you too, Madame Vane." Vane lowered the loupe and turned her head. Her sharp, calculating eyes swept over Morgan, taking in the bruised under-eyes, the pale skin, and the rigid set of her shoulders. She gave a single, microscopic nod of approval. "You survived the weekend? Good. Put your apron on. Wash your hands. We do not have time to coddle your emotional hangover. The Flemish piece arrived at dawn." Morgan walked over to the deep stainless steel sink. She scrubbed her hands with unscented surgical-grade soap, the harsh lather stripping the oils from her skin. She dried them on a lint-free towel, tied the thick canvas apron around her waist, and walked over to the wooden frame. The tapestry was immense, over 10 feet long, depicting a chaotic hunting scene from the late 1600s. The colors, once vibrant crimsons, deep indigos, and forest greens, were muted under centuries of smoke, dampness, and neglect. The edges were frayed, the weft threads unraveling, exposing the brittle linen warp underneath. It smelled of old earth, wood ash, and organic decay. It was a beautiful, magnificent ruin. "Moths!" Vane stated flatly, pointing a gloved finger at a large, degraded patch near the center where a woven stag was missing half its torso, and severe water damage from a chateau leak in the 19th century. The previous conservators attempted a crude backing patch in the 20s. It is creating structural tension. It must be removed. Morgan leaned in. The scent of the old wool filled her lungs. She looked at the microscopic damage, the severed threads curling back on themselves, brittle and desperate. It was a mess. A complicated, fragile mess that required absolute patience to fix. It required someone who understood that you couldn't force the fibers to do what they didn't want to do. You had to respect the tension. She reached into her toolkit and pulled out a pair of fine-tipped surgical scissors. The metal was cold against her fingers. For a fleeting second, the wet, tearing sound of Casey's gardening shears flashed through her mind. The violent, disrespectful severing of silk. Morgan's jaw tightened. She took a slow, deliberate breath, pushing the memory down, replacing it with the tactile reality of the steel in her hand. She pressed her elbows against the edge of the frame to stabilize her hands. Peering through the mounted magnifying glass, She isolated a single, rotten thread that was pulling the surrounding weave out of alignment. She didn't hack at it. She didn't force it. With surgical precision, she opened the tiny blades, slipped them around the corrupted fiber, and snipped. It was a clean, silent cut. With her tweezers, she gently extracted the dead thread, leaving a small, clean gap ready to be rewoven with stronger, stabilized material. The tension in the surrounding fabric immediately relaxed. The puckering smoothed out. The damage was still there, but the rot had been excised. Good, Vane murmured, watching her technique closely. Now match the dye for the replacement warp. Henri insists we use the cochineal extract. It will take 3 washes to achieve the correct fade. I'll mix the pigment, Morgan said, her voice dropping into a focused, even cadence. She walked over to the dye station, lined with glass beakers and digital scales. She began measuring out the crushed beetles, the distilled water, the mordant, the rhythmic clink of glass, the precise measurements, the quiet hum of the climate control. It all formed a protective, insulating bubble. The outside world, with its country clubs, its vicious matriarchs, and its cowardly boys, faded into total insignificance. This was where she belonged, among the ruined things, carefully, methodically making them whole again. She wasn't an accessory to a wealthy family. She wasn't a girl in a cheap dress waiting to be saved. She was the architect of preservation. She stirred the dark red dye with a glass rod, watching the pigment swirl and bloom in the water. Her bare left hand grasped the beaker. The pale indentation on her ring finger was already beginning to fade. By the time this tapestry was finished, the mark would be completely gone. She took a deep breath of the ammonia-laced air, set the beaker down, and went back to work. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet sound of a door closing and never looking back. Morgan chose her history over a hollow future, and we are absolutely here for that kind of boundaries. If you love this journey of vintage silk, toxic in-laws, and ultimate redemption, hit that like button and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder to never settle for less than they are worth. Subscribe to the channel for more raw, unfiltered stories that hit right in the chest. Drop a comment down below. What would you have done with the gardening shears?